Our names are McKenna Cardin, Niles A. Shannon, Rigo Cardenas, and Ella Schapp. Our research group is looking into the research question: is the reintroduction of sea otters on the Oregon coast feasible and advisable, economically, ecologically, and culturally? Sea otters are a keystone species, and without them, the environment can become unbalanced and cause many problems. For instance, because sea otters have been mostly gone from the Oregon coast in the early 1900s, sea urchins have overpopulated and eaten large areas of kelp forests. These kelp forests are a habitat for many marine animals, and without them, many species have no home. There is also a lot of conflict between the crab fishermen, local communities, environmentalists, and other people about whether they should be reintroduced. There are a lot of environmental issues impacting sea otters. Many people's garbage gets into the waterways, leading to the ocean and polluting the area. Oil spills are very bad for the environment, as they can harm the many animals living there. Many people are also not very cautious when fishing in boats and hit many sea otters in the ocean. One local stakeholder in this issue is the Alaka Alliance, which is working towards bringing sea otters back to the Oregon coast. Other stakeholders are local crab fishermen who don't want the sea otters to eat their crabs. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the organization that will decide if sea otters are reintroduced to the Oregon coast or not. Several aquariums on the West Coast are studying sea otters in captivity and in the wild. Oregon Wild is helping to bring sea otters back to the Oregon coast, while also supporting local tribal leaders in the effort. The maritime fur trade during the 18th and 19th centuries led to a depleted sea otter population. According to Dan Flores in the book Wild New World, thousands of sea otters were killed every year by Russian and American fur traders. At the peak of the slaughter in the early 1800s, 20,000 sea otter and fur seal skins were shipped to China each year. By the 1820s, there were so few sea otters left that it was not worth sailing all the way down to the Monterey, California area. That is why the sea otter survived there. The last Oregon sea otter was killed in 1906. In 1970 and 1971, scientists attempted to reintroduce sea otters to the Oregon coast. They brought 93 sea otters from the Aleutian Islands and relocated them to Oregon and Washington. They selected those sea otters because they were doing an atomic bomb test in their original home, which would kill them and their habitat. They decided to capture them and relocate them to keep them alive. Despite doing everything right, the reintroduced sea otters still managed to disappear. Predation by great white sharks or orcas, bad weather, or an uneven ratio of female sea otters to male sea otters could have caused them to disappear. This random fluctuation in population size that can cause the population to thrive or not is called demographic stochasticity. This explains why the reintroduced sea otters on the Washington coast survived, while the Oregon sea otters didn't. The sea otters in Oregon experienced a series of unfortunate events that didn't allow them to survive, leading to the reintroduction failing. Scientists learned a great deal from this unsuccessful relocation that can help increase the chances of success in the future. For example, tagging and tracking released sea otters will be critical. We hypothesized that after assessing our research, the pros of reintroduction will outweigh the cons, and that sea otters should be reintroduced. Sea otters can help reduce the sea urchin population, allowing the kelp forest to regrow and the marine species that live in the kelp to flourish.
Sea otters have a soft, dense underfur and colored brown to black and silver. They have webbed hind feet and short front stiff toes. Sea otters have about 1 million hairs per square inch, more than any other animal. Related species to the sea otters are weasels, skunks, badgers, and minks. Sea otters live in the shallow coastal waters of the North Pacific. Their current range is Alaska, Russia, British Columbia, Washington, and California. Historically, they are found in Baja California, north of the coast of southern Alaska. West across the Aleutian Islands to the Kamchatka Peninsula, Russia, and south to the northern islands of Japan. Southern sea otters can be found on the central California's coast. Northern sea otters can be found across the coast of Alaska and Washington. Asian otters can be found along the Asian coast. Their diet consists of sea urchins, crabs, mussels, and clams. To locate their food, they use their whiskers and dig out clams with their strong forepaws. Their predators are killer whales, sharks, coyotes, brown bears, and eagles. Sea otters reach sexual maturity at 5 to 4 years old. Sea otters usually have one pup at a time once a year. They can be pregnant for at least 4 months and at most 9 months, with an average of 6 months. Males live 10 to 15 years and females live 15 to 20 years, but in captivity, they both could live up to 25 years. One of the biggest threats to the sea otters are oil spills and other forms of pollution. According to the IUCN Red List, 2,800 otters were killed by the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska in 1989. Sea otters have been protected by the International Fur Seal Treaty since 1911. Our research locations were at Bob Straub State Park, the Oregon Coast Aquarium, the Oregon Zoo, and the Seattle Aquarium in Monterey Bay, California. For the Seattle Aquarium, we watched the sea otters through their live cams, and Mr. Weddle took data on the Californias in California. We also visited the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Oregon Coast National Wildlife Refuge Complex in Newport. The materials that we used in the field were a pencil, paper, clipboard, data sheet, and stopwatch. In the classroom, we also used Chromebooks. We relied on reports and articles from organizations for much of our research. On November 7th at Bob Straub State Park, we measured the amount of rack using a designated method which was developed by last year's Coast Group. We use a fist to estimate a 10 square centimeter of rack. We have adopted Mile 259 as part of the Oregon Shores Coast Watch program. We also walked along the beach and kept track of what we saw, like the number of birds, dogs, humans, and we recorded this on a Coast Watch database. On the 21st of November, we went to the Oregon Coast Aquarium to observe sea otters in captivity. One person would watch the assigned sea otter and report what the sea otter was doing every 15 seconds for 10 minutes. The designated behaviors were swimming, eating, floating, diving, grooming, playing, and rolling. Another person had a clipboard and recorded the behavior that was called to them. We use our ethogram data to show the typical captive sea otter behaviors.
In addition to taking our ethogram data at the Oregon Coast Aquarium, we also got the chance to go behind the enclosure and talk to some of the staff there. Afterwards, we left the aquarium to have an interview with the staff from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Oregon Coast National Wildlife Refuge Complex. Our group asked questions about sea otter introduction and research. On the 13th of January 2025, we went to the Oregon Zoo and took more ethogram data, standing by the enclosure and writing down their activities, using the same procedure as before. We also spent time walking around, looking at different animals. We also met with Chanel Payson of the Alaka Alliance. On January 27th, we watched a live stream of the Seattle Aquarium sea otter enclosure, taking more data using the same procedure or as close as we could. Looking at our overall data, we found that the sea otters spent a majority of the time floating or swimming. Playing and diving were the least frequently observed behaviors. Looking deeper into our data, we discovered that the Oregon Coast Aquarium otters had some basic behavior differences. Oswald swam in their enclosure 20% of the time, while Schuster was only swimming 5.4% of the time. On the other hand, they both spent the most time rolling. We later took data on 3 more otters, Juno, Shushi, and Lincoln, at the Oregon Zoo. These otters were the most playful of the otters we observed, but that wasn't their most frequent activity. They also spent time floating, while Shushi played with Lincoln from time to time. As indicated by the yellow slice, we saw the keepers doing environmental enrichment with the sea otters. They had to perform specific behaviors to receive food. Juno, like the other otters at the Oregon Zoo, spent most of the time floating and swimming, followed by grooming as her next most common activity. The Seattle Aquarium sea otters, Mishka and Siku, both swam the most at 77.5% and 60%. This was much more than the other otters we observed. Mishka spent 30% of the time floating, whereas Siku's second most common behavior was eating. On March 31st, Mr. Weddle gave us data on a wild sea otter he observed at Moss Landing near Monterey, California. This sea otter spent almost all of its time diving for food and then eating it. A large part of our research involved gathering information on the pros and cons of sea otter introduction. We read several articles and reports dealing with the ecological, economic, and cultural concerns. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service held 16 open houses along the Oregon and Northern California coasts because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wanted people to express their feelings about the sea otter introduction. Around 800 people had participated in the open houses. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used the feedback to consider solutions for future reintroduction problems. This open house information includes the perspective of the attendees on what they value and how they believe sea otters would affect those values. Attendees also shared a variety of concerns related to ecosystem health, shellfish industry, tribal consideration, ecotourism, fishery impacts, and many other values. In general, these open houses educated the community, spread awareness, and showed the steps for reintroduction. The report summarizes the opinion of all the stakeholder groups. For example, crab fishermen said that if reintroduced, they were concerned that the sea otters could pose a threat towards their livelihood. Sea otters could also impact the commercial harvest of abalone, sea urchins, and clams. On the other hand, many said that if reintroduced, could create ecotourism dogs and employment opportunities with wildlife viewing tours.
Overall, the captive sea otters floated most of the time. This is probably because they don't have to hunt for their food and have specific feeding times. They also have a variety of enrichment items they can engage with. With this, they have more time to hang around and be more social than the wild otters. The wild sea otter, Mr. Weddle observed in Monterey, California, spent most of its time eating and diving for food. Wild sea otters eat a lot because, unlike the captive sea otters, they have to hunt for their food. They use more energy hunting compared to the captive sea otters and must work harder for the food that they get. This means that they need a lot of food to have enough energy to survive. Last year, the group found that the sea otters spent more time eating than any other behavior. We believe they were eating more frequently compared to this year because they did ectograms before and after eating time, while we only did it before eating. Time of day can really affect the otters' activities. Last year's group also found that they swam and floated for a lot of their time as well. This was very similar to our data because we did ectograms on the same sea otters around the same time of year. The rock we found averaged 9.6% of each 1 meter square. We didn't find as much rock as we thought we would because it wasn't after a storm and was during high tide. If we had come during low tide or after a storm, we would have found more. This part of our research was not the main focus of the project, but was a Coast Watch project continuation from last year's research group. We believe our research supports our hypothesis and it would be ideal to bring sea otters back to the Oregon coast. Economically, the sea otters would benefit the economy through ecotourism. Many people would want to go on boat tours to see the sea otters, which would get the tour companies more money. In turn, the money they make through ecotourism can be used to fund sea otter research. In the Monterey area, in 2022, sea otters accounted for $3.2 million in the economy, as stated in an article by Jessica Fuji and others in the Journal of Ocean and Coastal Economics. Despite crab fishermen's fears, sea otters wouldn't have much effect on Dungeness crab fishing because the otters live in shallow waters while the commercial fishermen crab in deeper waters. In addition, according to an article done by Andrea Boosty in Biological Conservation, it states that Dungeness crabs only make up about 2% of the sea otter diet. Ecologically, the sea otters would help the kelp forest regrow by eating the purple sea which in turn gives other marine animals a healthy habitat. This means that there will be more biodiversity on the Oregon coast. Kelp forests will also help controlling the acidity in the water. High acidity makes Dungeness crab shells softer, allowing their predators to catch them more easily. Without this acidity in the water, Dungeness crab can thrive better, and crab fishermen can get more crab. Sea otters also eat the invasive ring crabs that are making it so other native crustaceans struggle to thrive. Historically, sea otters were a huge part of the indigenous culture, and they would hunt some of them for fur coats to stay warm during the winter months. Many natives have said that they feel sea otters are like a long-lost family member and would love for them to be back in that cultural family. In the indigenous culture, sea otters were much more than just animals. They symbolized adaptability and survival. Also, for several native tribes, the sea otters were a large economic resource. We believe sea otters should come back to the Oregon coast. The Alaka Alliance has a strategic action plan that's 3 important parts: strong partnerships, community engagements, and regional consideration. We agree with their suggestions. We faced some challenges in our research. When watching the Seattle Aquarium live cam, we were limited because there was times where we couldn't see one of the otters while doing the ethograms. Some human errors that might have occurred were at Bob Straub State Park, where we could have possibly miscalculated the rack data because we all have different sized fists. Additionally, at the Oregon Zoo, one of the ethogram groups was 15 cents behind the other. We think students shouldn't do this topic as a field-based research group until the otters are reintroduced in Oregon. However, JGM should continue to research sea otters for the 7th grade Endangered Species Project. In the future, FBR groups could shoot a research question related to how sea urchin population changed before and after sea otters were in Oregon, or how the sea star wasting disease affected the boat health in sea urchins in Oregon. Special thanks to Miss Ames, Mr. Weddle, Miss Weddle, Miss Izzy, Michelle St. Martin from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Patricia McBride from the Oregon Coast Aquarium, Rob McCoy from the Oregon Zoo, Chanel Payson from the Alaka Alliance, and the panelists. Any questions?
All right, panelists and Fungus, you can head out to my room. Panelists, any questions?
Awesome job, Lieutenant Niles, Rico, and Ella. Good to see you again. Obviously, I am really close to this project, so it's really exciting to hear everything that you figured out through your research and observations. Amazing job. I had a quick question about the ecograms. So between swimming and diving, what is the difference between those when you observe the sea otters?
Diving we just have as if they were physically like going down, we'd have that as diving. Swimming would just be any other activity where they were physically moving on their stomachs.
I had another question about the ecograms. What specific actions or behaviors did you classify as play?
When they were like messing with each other, or like I'm pretty sure in the Oregon Zoo they had like balls and other things to play with while they could.
So I have a question. So you mentioned that the crab fishermen are like against otter reintroduction, but that the otters actually forage like shallow water and the crabs are deeper. So like through the open houses or anything, like have the fishermen like taken that information and like changed their mind at all about sea otter reintroduction, or are they arguing like that that's true, gonna come deeper to get the crabs?
The open houses were in 2023, so the data could have changed by then.
I also believe it definitely has changed certain crab fishermen's opinions, since Dungeness crabs don't really make up that much of their diet, only 2%. So I think a lot of people don't really realize that, and that Dungeness crab make up like almost all their diet.
Do you also know if there's any, like, if any of the other things that sea otters eat are competitive towards Dungeness crabs that will also help like leverage that to fishermen?
I actually don't know. Do you guys know? I don't think we ever came across that in our research.
Can any of you define exactly what a keystone species is?
So a keystone species is a specific type of species that basically kind of holds the environment together. And so without them, the environment sort of can fall apart and become unstable. As the sea otters have proven that now there's only sea urchins on the Oregon coast.
Yeah, exactly. So relative to the number of animals, they have a really big impact. Great definition.
What can the average person do to help Oregon bring back the sea otters?
I think any way you can spread like awareness about sea otters introduction or anything about like whatever you can really think about that is important about the sea otters can definitely help. As well as working with people to talk about reintroduction just so that you have more knowledge of it, I think can really help.
Did you have a favorite sea otter that you observed during this time?
My favorite was maybe Sushi or Juno, just because they were very playful and they were just hanging out all the time, and I thought it was really cute.
What's the one I think was
Oswald?
no, the one that was like playing with the basketball.
Juno or
Yeah.
Sushi?
No, it's
Yeah, that one was my favorite.
My favorite was sushi. It's probably the cutest one.
My favorite was also Sushi. I think she was one of the youngest ones we saw. And also, I loved how she followed Juno around because Juno was her adopted mom. And it was so cute.
I have a question. I guess I'll start with you. You talked about the reintroduction failing because of all these random bad luck that happened, and you called that demographic stochasticity. What is the opposite of that?
So the opposite of demographic stochasticity is demographic determinism. And an example of that is that the scientists knew that if they did the atomic bomb tests in the Aleutian Islands, they knew that those sea otters and their habitat would be destroyed, so they determined that.
Thank you.
We have a little bit more time. Are there any other questions, either from the panel or even from out here in the audience?
Yeah, I always have tons of questions. RAC, I mean, why was last year's group interested in RAC? What started our stuff on RAC? You're feeding him the answer. You can just tell us.
What if you guys came to Iraq? To see how much the sea urchins like destroyed the kelp forest and how much like washed up on the shore.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's
There had been reports that there was lots of RAC, and they wanted a way of measuring that. So when we used that data sheet, what were we doing with that data sheet?
We were making sure that it worked the way we wanted and that it would be easy enough for citizen scientists to do.
Thank you. Very good.
I think we had a question from Sarah back here.
Yeah, when was the last sighting?
In 1906.
So nobody's seen any sea otters in Oregon since 1906?
Well, there are occasional sea otters that come through Oregon, but no sea otters have actually stayed in Oregon to live. The last one was in 1906 that has lived there.
Can I ask a follow-up question? And I asked Chanel earlier. Chanel, have you seen any sea otters on the Oregon coast lately?
So the last live sighting was at the end of June last year with 2 males from the Washington population off of Cannon Beach. To
what color were his teeth?
Can you guess it?
Purple.
Why is that?
Because purple sea urchins.
Do you know what that process is called that makes them turn their bones and their teeth purple? I know, it's a hard thing to remember. It's called echinochrome staining. I have a picture of that kind of decomposed sea otter if you want to see it. If you don't know what it's at. But it's really cool.
So is that from the Washington group too?
Yeah, so it's like 5 to 6 times a year we'll have mostly dead sea otters washed ashore, pretty decomposed, and they're all males from the Washington population.
So how come none, I mean, it's about maybe a little farther, coming from Monterey to southern Oregon, why don't some of them come north from the southern, do you guys know that? You guys, actually, we talked about this, why don't they come from the south?
I'm pretty sure there's like a section where there's like a bunch of sharks or like orcas or something, and so if they try to go up, they get eaten by the predators.
And there's this wall of great white sharks,
Yeah.
adolescents apparently.
So there's a 900-mile gap from the Washington population to the next population, which is the biggest gap in their whole native range, where sea otters used to be that there's 0. And so the sea otter population in California cannot expand naturally anymore because of predation of juvenile white sharks. So they can't go any further north where there is Kelporus habitat because all these white sharks are having a heyday. And they don't actually eat sea otters, but they take investigative bites because it looks like a seal or a sea lion that they really want to eat because it's super fatty, but sea otters lack that blubber and they have that fur that we just learned how thick it is. So yeah, they can't naturally expand, so unless we do translocation north of California as well, then that's never gonna grow up.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we're about out of time for the sea otters. Let's give them one more round of applause. Great. Sea otters, please exit the way you practice. Come back to your seats, please. And then once they are past, JGEN students, you can head back to the library. And then parents and other guests, thank you so much for coming. We're going to swap you out for a different set now and move on to our next group.